Continuing on with Chapter 32, we're looking at the politics and the economics of the 1920s leading us to the Great Depression. Now, after the death of Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, his vice president, obviously assumed the role of president. Silent Cal, as he was called, because he didn't really say much. And whereas Harding's administration was known as very corrupt, Silent Cal was almost the exact opposite. He was almost puritanically honest as a president. He is also a huge advocate of business in America. To him, the business of the American people is business. He worshipped at the altar of American business. So he is going to be a huge proponent for anything that will help business in America. This is how we create a good economy from his mind. And especially by giving those tax breaks to the wealthy as part of Andrew Mellon's tax cut plan so that that prosperity will trickle down. Calvin Coolidge is very much interested in laissez-faire, and this is going to also include laissez-faire towards farmers. Remember, it's terrible to be a farmer in America except for during World War I. And so farmers are starting to feel how terrible it is to be in their line of business after World War I is over. Remember, World War I was the prime time for them to make all their money that they did because there was a huge demand for agricultural products and Europe was war-torn, so there wasn't a lot of competition. But after World War I was over, that consumerism started to die off for them when it came to people wanting to buy their products. There's also an increased competition coming back from Europe at this time. Add to that the fact that farmers are starting to buy all of these new products that are coming out of the factories back east. They don't have the money. So the value of farm products was starting to go down. There's a huge supply. In fact, farmers are producing way more than they should, and thus that drives the prices down. This is the problem of the commons. If you are an individual farmer, the way you can potentially make more money is by growing more crops. But if everyone decides to grow more crops, this adds to a surplus, and therefore the value of your crops goes down. You are exacerbating that issue. So farmers at this time, farmer voter blocks in the West particularly and the South as well, were looking to have some relief from the devastation that they were feeling, the fact that they weren't making any money anymore and the price of crops was going down so much. In 1921, Congress passed the Caper-Volstead Act. This basically exempted farmers from antitrust legislation, allowed them to form farm cooperatives in order to work together to keep the value of their crops up without being charged as a monopoly. They also wanted passage of the McNary-Haugen bill. This never happened. It was tried to be pushed through 3 different times, but it was vetoed every single time. Basically, what the farmer groups wanted at this time was they didn't want to limit the amount of stuff that they were producing, their agricultural products. Instead, they wanted the U.S. government to buy up any surpluses that farmers had and then dump it overseas on the international markets. So in this way, we're creating false scarcity, and therefore the value of those crops would go up without them not having to produce less money. This was never passed because it was vetoed every single time. From Calvin Coolidge's perspective, this was too much government involvement. Here you see Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge on Inauguration Day. So looking at the 1920s, from the surface, and we've talked about this before, economically it seems great. People are working again, people have money to buy all these new consumer products, but below the surface we're starting to see some international problems that are going to also lead us to the Great Depression. We were a creditor nation during World War I, and in fact the majority of our debt was owed to us by our allies from World War I. Great Britain and France owed us about $16 billion from World War I. The problem with this is that France and Great Britain have no money to pay the United States back from this debt. The only way that they can make this money back or to pay our debts off is to start collecting the war reparations that they were demanding from Germany. The $32 billion that was required of Germany for that war guilt clause for quote-unquote causing World War I. Well, Germany doesn't have any money either, so instead France tries to take their war reparation by seizing control of the Ruhr Valley. This was where Germany did most of its industrialization. This only added insult to injury to the problem. So Germany said, okay, you want all your money, you want your war reparations, we'll do that. So in October of 1923, they allowed their economy to hyperinflate, meaning they were just printing off the Deutschmark like nothing. The value of their currency, the Deutschmark, was practically worthless. So they said, you want your money? Here it is. But the value of that money that they're trying to pay their reparations with is worth next to nothing. It's not even worth the paper that it's printed on, pretty much. So this could have caused a serious international crisis right then and there in 1923, because to hyperinflate one economy and to pay off debts with this worthless currency could have meant the collapse of the international economy right then and there. So instead, Charles Dawes, who was Coolidge's vice president, created the Dawes Plan in 1924 as a solution. This isn't really a solution, it's more just prolonging the international crisis that's coming. Basically what the Dawes Plan would do is they rescheduled those reparation payments to make them smaller, and gradually Germany would have to pay more and more and more over the coming months and years. And therefore then Great Britain could pay back their money to the United States. But in order to get this money flowing, the United States would loan to Germany money to them to start rebuilding their economy. So here's what we're creating here. The United States is loaning money to Germany through private loans, building up businesses, etc. They then use that money to pay off their war reparations, and then Great Britain and France then use that money to pay back the United States. It's creating a cycle of debt between these major countries of the world. And sure, at least at the time, it makes it seem like everything's okay. But once the stock market collapsed in 1929, the United States started very quickly running out of money that it could loan to foreign governments. So not only did our economy dry up, but the other countries of Europe dried up as well. The Depression was not just an American phenomenon, it was an international phenomenon as well. So they're robbing Peter to pay Paul in this case. So at the end of the 1920s, everything, like I said, seems very good. The economy seems like it's booming. We have great prosperity here, unless you're a farmer, of course. So the Republicans can't lose, really. They really just need to nominate somebody that's half worthwhile for the American people to elect. So in 1928, the Republicans nominate conservative Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover, based on a platform of prosperity and prohibition. He is the epitome of the American dream, a self-made man. He wanted people to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and do for themselves. He doesn't believe in big government. He says government should stay out of people's lives. You should let the free market dictate how the economy is run. All of these things that conservative Republicans of the day believed in. The Democrats, on the other side, nominated New York Governor Al Smith. Al Smith, aside from being the New York governor, he is the first Catholic ever nominated for this high position in as the presidency. He was also a quote-unquote wet, meaning he was against prohibition. So Al Smith, though, has really two strikes against him. Number one, the fact that he is a Catholic from New York. He has this thick accent on the radio. And remember, people are very fearful of Catholics in America. Even in today, there is some question about Catholics in America as the highest position. And so there was definitely some discrimination against Al Smith as a Catholic. And it became a popular thing for Republicans to say that a vote for Al Smith is a vote for the Pope. This was not coming from Hoover, but from other Republicans within his party. So really in 1928, that solid South that we think of as always voting for the Democrats to some degree defected because they just couldn't wrap their heads around voting for this New York Catholic that has a thick accent on the radio. The only Democrats that really did stay with the Democratic Party in the South was the Deep South. These are the Hoovercrats, the ones that had left the party in order to vote for Herbert Hoover. So in a landslide victory victory, and this is going to be very ironic 4 years later, because as much as Herbert Hoover won in 1928, by that much is how much he's going to lose 4 years later when we are full effect in the Great Depression. In a landslide victory, 444 electoral votes to 87. And in a somewhat ironic speech on his inauguration day, and I'm talking months before the stock market crash and the beginning of the Great Depression, Herbert Hoover said, "We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of this land. We shall soon, with the help of God, be in sight of the day when poverty will be banished from this land." Not even a year later, the Great Depression hits, and 25% plus of the population is out of work. Here you see the electoral map in 1928. So, in America, we oftentimes say, what caused the Great Depression? And we always think, the classic answer is, oh, the stock market crash. That is a very simplistic look at why there was a Great Depression in the United States. There are multiple things that played into this economic disaster. The stock market crash is more really the symptom than it is the cause, showing that the economy was not as good as they had thought it had been. But let's take a look first at the crash of 29. It had seemed like prosperity would continue on and on and on forever. We've talked about people buying on the margin, this speculation in the stock market, that you feel like you can't lose when you invest in the stock market. That can't continue on forever. That speculative bubble is going to have to burst at some point or another, where the stock market takes a little bit of a nosedive. And that came on Black Tuesday, as it was called, October 29th, 1929, when the stock market began to crash. That exaggerated bull market could not continue to go up and up and up. People were looking for quick money. That quick money can't continue to go on. And so rumors started to circulate that the market was about to crash. This creates a self-fulfilling prophecy, because that fear that I don't want to be the one to lose my money in the stock market, people start running on the stock market to sell their shares as quickly as possible. Same as we've seen in the past with a run on the bank. It's the same idea. There was a minor dip in the stock market when Great Britain raised its interest rates on American securities, and this caused a little bit of a dip and then complete and total panic. Within this one day, 16 million shares were sold and a loss of $40 billion within the next 2 months. That's insane for the stock market crash. And this is marking the very beginning of the overall contraction of the economy folding in on itself instead of continuing to go out and out and out. And so even though we say that the Great Depression was caused by the stock market crash, that's not really true. This is just a symbol, or it is a symptom, that overall the economy was being built on a terrible foundation. Speculation, buying on the margin, is one of those examples. Here you see the massive crash. The overall height of the 1920 stock market, and then the continued crash all the way down to its very lowest level in 1932. So let's take a look overall at all of the causes for the Great Depression, which is going to be the focus of the upcoming chapters. And really this is a which came first, the chicken or the egg type problem. You can't point and say this one thing caused this to happen, this to happen, this to happen. It's the fact that all of this stuff was happening at the same time during the 1920s led to the overall Great Depression. First and foremost, we were overproducing way too many consumer products. That consumerism was out of control, that we were building too many Model T cars and too many toasters and vacuum cleaners and washing machines and all that stuff. You can't sustain that level of buying. How many toasters can a consumer buy? Even if you try to make people feel bad with advertising that you want the newest of the new, consumerism can't keep up with that crazy level. Add into that the people who were making money off of the sale of all of these consumer products were the owners of the business. Now, what they should have done was take that money that they were making from selling Model Ts or selling toasters or vacuum cleaners or whatnot, and then invest it into people's salaries. Because if people have more money in their pocket, then they can then go out and buy even more consumer products. The reality was they weren't doing that. They were taking that money and either spending it on their own extremely lavish lifestyles. In fact, we see more billionaires during the 1920s than ever before at this time, or they were investing it in the stock market to create crazy high amounts of money during that crazy bull market that was going on. And so the working and middle class who was left behind, sure, there was a somewhat higher standard of living than we've seen in the past, but not enough to sustain the amount of stuff that they wanted to buy. And so credit was very easily available, and so people were buying these goods on credit. This gave this false sense of prosperity. Well, look at all the stuff that I have. I must have a really good life. But the reality is that people couldn't afford these lifestyles for very long. There's only so long today you can hold out buying stuff on credit cards before it's going to come back to haunt you. It's the same idea in the 1920s. Add into that all those foreign economic problems that we've already talked about, that cycle of debt with the Dawes Plan, the hyperinflation of the German economy, and these debts and loans that the United States was basing on, adds to this problem. And then finally, that Hawley Smooth tariff that we talked about before, that crazy high tariff that the United States created, only exacerbated the issues. It didn't allow for a free trade within the world. We had walled ourselves off from the rest of the world, yet still expected people to buy overseas to buy our products. And so in 1929, the stock market crashed. This is only the beginning of the Great Depression. It's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. And Herbert Hoover, he should have been considered one of the better presidents that we've ever had, but he really was in the wrong place at the wrong time. His philosophy, this rugged individualism that people need to do it for themselves, is not going to work in the face of 25% plus unemployment in the United States. He really believed that people should either do it themselves or charities should take up the slack. But there is too much poverty going on after the 29 crash and into the 30s to allow for charities to handle that level of relief that was needed at this time. It was way too widespread. The government needed to step in. So the one thing, though, that Herbert Hoover did do, he did try some public works projects, like the building of the Hoover Dam. This creates jobs for people working on the dam. But the one thing that Herbert Hoover did do, and do not ever get this confused with all of the alphabet soup agencies that FDR created, and we'll talk about that in the next chapter, was to create the Reconstruction Finance Corporation in 1932. This is really focusing on that trickle-down prosperity that we've talked about before. The government would loan money to railroad companies, to banks, and to major corporations to keep them on their feet. And then that prosperity would, quote-unquote, trickle down to the lower classes, because then jobs were sustained. This is also known as supply-side economics, because you are giving money to those who supply the economy. And it's also known as pump priming economics, because he's trying to just get the economy going a little bit and then let that invisible hand of commerce take over again. In reality, even though Herbert Hoover had some good ideas, it's too little too late. And there's a lot of criticism aimed at Herbert Hoover for this, because many people are looking at the Depression saying, these are the companies that started this Depression. You're going to give more money to big business, you're going to give more money to banks and railroad companies, and they're the ones that started this Depression. What about us poor people here on the ground who are starving to death, who are dying? Where is our money from the government? And so at this point, it's too little too late. There's really nothing Herbert Hoover can do. He is not going to win the upcoming 32 election. The final nail in Herbert Hoover's coffin comes in the summer of 1932. This is just before the election between him and Franklin Roosevelt, who we'll talk about later. That bonus that the World War I veterans had been promised, remember that Adjusted Compensation Act that they had demanded, was not set to come due until 1945. Well, it's 1932, and people don't have any money. Here are World War I veterans starving, they don't have jobs, etc. So they were demanding their bonus early. They marched on Washington and set up a quote-unquote Hooverville just outside of Washington, D.C. at Anacostia Flats. So Hooverville was a shanty town, and it's obviously a slam against Herbert Hoover at this time. The government could not allow these World War I veterans to protest, this bonus army as they were called. And so the army was called in to disband this protest led by General Douglas MacArthur, who will make a real name for himself in World War II, along with Major George Patton, and also Eisenhower was there as well. In the end, tear gas was used, bayonets were used against these helpless, starving World War I veterans, and all of this made the newspapers of the day. How could you do this to our veterans? This, like I said, is the final nail in Hoover's coffin. No matter what he did, no matter what he didn't do, he was going to be blamed for the Great Depression, even though it obviously was not his fault. Here you see this an image from the Bonus Army March on Washington. Notice this is Hoovertown, this way towards normalcy, the other way towards prosperity, and that sign up there in the middle. And here is that shanty town that was disbanded by the Army. And that is it for Chapter 32.